The Startide Massacre. The deck plates of this part of the warship quietly thrummed, sending a steady, soothing vibration to pulse up Tashia's hooves. It felt like the heartbeat of a vessel built for exploration and conquest. It was a heart, like hers, that yearned for adventure. She could hardly believe she was here, on one of the many vessels that made up the great shore-strike armada. The thought thrilled her. The expansion of the benevolent Tau Empire and the enlightenment it spread was manifest destiny. So to be at the forefront of the fourth sphere of expansion was the greatest honor of her life. There was no doubt in her mind that what they were about to do would be enshrined in Tau history. It would inspire future generations to follow in their footsteps, to spread a message of hope and harmony across a galaxy that so desperately needed their guiding hand. With some free time before she had to be at her assigned station, Tashia found herself drawn to the secondary cargo bay. She made her way down the sleek corridors of the void ship, making sure to avoid any other members of her caste that might question where she was going. When she reached the cargo bay, she paused just outside the main doors and poked in her head to look around the corner. She couldn't see anyone that might ask what she was doing there, so she slinked inside. The air in the cargo bay carried the sharp tang of ozone and stagnant recycled air. But she'd made so many visits down here lately that the scent had become familiar, so she barely even noticed it as she looked around. Arranged in rows were towering stacks of metal supply crates lined up in perfect military precision and mag-locked to the deck plates for safety. The gentle hum and whiz of automated drones filled the cavernous room as they tirelessly buzzed around transporting equipment and reorganizing the crates. Leaning against an open metal container, his back to her, Tashia spotted Holland. A drone idly hovered nearby. He was furiously inputting commands into a data slate he held in one hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. She watched him for a moment. He looked so earnest. It was so unlike his usual carefree demeanor. Tashia caught herself looking at Holland a little too intently and shook the notion off. But she couldn't hold back the urge to at least say something to him. After all, she'd come all this way to visit him. Holland was so engrossed in his work, fingers flicking through different menus and inventory logs, he failed to notice Tashia as she stealthily approached him from behind.
Gwe Vessa, stand to, don't slouch,
Tashia barked. Holland stiffened.
Yes, Chassot? Apologies, Chassot.
He blurted out, spinning around to face her. The moment their eyes met, his posture eased, and a wide grin broke across his face.
Would you stop doing that? You're going to give me a heart attack one of these days.
He chuckled. With a little conscious effort, Tashia contracted her face muscles in an approximation of a human smile.
To think I have such power over your heart.
That's not what I meant.
You make messing with you too easy. I tell you what, you stop being so gullible and I'll stop doing it.
She teased, reaching out and playfully nudging his arm.
You really never change, do you?
Holland shook his head.
Why mess with perfection?
Tashia teased.
Perfection? That's not exactly the word I would use to describe you.
Holland said.
Is that so? Then enlighten me. What word would you use to describe me?
Tashia asked, raising an eyebrow quizzically. Holland's face became flushed.
Wish I had time to sit and chat, but some of the munitions were logged in wrong.
Holland said, changing the subject.
If I don't track them down before we leave Numenor Point, it's going to be a real problem.
Oh, I see.
With all the inventory we're carrying, it's like seeking a tripper in a Jiroshi.
Anything I can do to help?
No, but thanks. Just got to do a manual inspection with some good old-fashioned leg work.
He sighed. With the press of a button, the drone hovering nearby shot off to retrieve another crate.
Legwork? Looks more like you're letting them do all the work for you.
They're better at it,
he admitted, keying another quick command into the data slate.
I thought you used to say you were irreplaceable.
Oh, I am. The drones may be more efficient than me, but they lack my winning personality,
he said, grinning again.
Well, I'd better report to my station, but I'll come find you after. I can't wait to tell you all about how it goes with the slipstream drive. It's so very exciting. This is history in the making.
All the best. Go make history,
Holland said, holding up a hand and crossing two of his thin human fingers in a sign that humans did to wish good fortune.
Then, I'll see you later,
Tashia said with a nod. Then she turned and left. Holland watched her form as she walked away, before reluctantly shifting his attention back to his work. Tashia made her way through the ship's corridors, her mind buzzing with thoughts of the grand adventure they were all about to embark upon. Eventually, she reached the starboard observation deck. With no official duties to see to during the fleet's departure from Numenor Point, she had been granted permission to witness firsthand this great moment for the Tau Empire. The observation deck was a vast, long chamber with tiered platforms arranged before a reinforced viewing window that spanned the length of the wall. Representatives of the fire, earth, air, and water castes were in attendance. They gathered in small groups and murmured to one another in hushed tones as they all gazed out into the void of space. The rest of the Shore Strike armada stretched out before them, sleek vessels, the pinnacle of Tau technology and design, hung like works of art in the star-studded darkness beyond the window. As she entered, a small drone descended from the ceiling to scan her ID. With a pleasant beep, confirming she was authorized to be there, it ascended back out of view. Tashia stepped forward and into the gathered throng of people, awestruck at the sight before her. From loudspeakers discreetly incorporated into the ceiling rang an authoritative and wizened voice.
"The time has come,"
said ethereal Ankola.
"The path before us is vast, stretching beyond the limits of sight and certainty. But we do not walk it alone. We move as one, as a tide guided by purpose, as a current that shapes the stars themselves. This is the way of the Tauva."
She paused for a moment, letting the words hang in the air and stir the hearts of every Tau listening.
"Let our will be unwavering, our hearts aligned, and our journey be a beacon for those who will follow and join us in our noble purpose. Orosi Shathri Tskan Shatauva. Unity comes to all things, in time, and we shall be its bearers."
A wave of awe passed through the crowd as the command to engage the AL-38 slipstream drive was given. Tashia made her way closer to the viewport. She placed her hands on the polished chrome rail that spanned the width of the window and leant forward to drink in the sight of the armada as it prepared to leap across the galaxy. The sight was breathtaking. Tashia thought that it was a shame that Holland couldn't see it. But unfortunately, auxiliaries weren't permitted on the observation deck at this time, most being assigned to important tasks across the ship to facilitate this momentous event. The excitement around Tashia reached a fevered pitch as the countdown began. 3. An almost imperceptible vibration resonated throughout the ship as power was rerouted to the drive systems. The glow of distant drives and thrusters pulsed on the rest of the armada in a synchronized display that formed a sparkling constellation of energy waiting to be unleashed. Tashia's fingers tightened on the railing. It was beautiful. 2. The lights across the chamber dimmed. Conversations faded into a collective breath of anticipation. Outside the viewport, the first ships in the formation began to shimmer, their hulls flickering with the distortion of activated slipstream fields, as the forces of the universe and the laws of physics was bent to the will of the Tau by their technological mastery. 1. Reality shattered. Not in a controlled way, but rather like the shattering of glass. Abrupt, harsh, irreversible. The activation of so many slipstream drives in such close proximity was too much for the fabric of reality to bear, and it broke under the weight. There were gasps and cries of alarm as empty space dissolved into swirling tendrils of colorless, formless mass that lashed out and wrapped around the vessels of the armada, smothering them. Then the space around Numenor Point was consumed by a swirling, erratic maelstrom of heaving, chaotic non-existence that swallowed everything. The vessels of the armada didn't jump through space. Instead, they collapsed and fell into the rent in reality, to plummet down through the gap that lies just beneath the veil of our existence. More panicked shouts erupted around Tashia as the ship bucked wildly and bodies lurched against one another as they were violently thrown around. She fought down a wave of nausea as the artificial gravity flickered, and she was torn between total weightlessness and the oppressive pull of gravity far higher than it should have been. She clutched at the railing, her entire body rigid as she tried to keep her footing. Her vision swam, and for the briefest of moments, all she could see was blackness. When her vision returned, the viewport in front of her was no longer a window to space. Instead, it was a portal to a place she could hardly believe existed. The stars had been devoured, replaced by an expanse of shifting, living darkness, of writhing colors and rolling storm clouds that crackled with ceaseless purple lightning. The entire ship convulsed as a violent tremor rippled through its superstructure from prow to stern. Tashia lost her grip on the railing and was thrown to slam against the floor. It felt as though something unimaginably colossal had taken hold of the vessel and given it a brutal shake. Before she could stand, the gravitic plates in the observation deck let out a tortured wail before failing completely. The screams and shouts of panic became more urgent as flailing crew members slowly tumbled upwards as the artificial gravity that kept them in place dissipated. Tashia barely had a moment to react before she too began to float away. She pressed her hooves against the reinforced glass of the viewport, lined up her trajectory, and then pushed off, her body uncoiling as she propelled herself toward the open doors of the exit. She twisted and spun to avoid the other crew in the full knowledge that the slightest impact would rob her of her momentum and strand her here. Somewhere above her, a console exploded in a shower of golden sparks that whizzed in all directions in the zero gravity. Tashia ignored it and focused solely on her goal of the rapidly approaching exit to the corridor. She tucked her arms in and prepared herself as she passed the observation deck's threshold and glided into the corridor beyond. Gravity suddenly reasserted itself, yanking her to the ground. She landed with a roll and rose to her feet in a fluid motion. She turned to see that the panic in the observation deck had already started to subside as Tau began to work together to reach the exit. Members of the air caste practically swam around the room, offering assistance where they could, such as helping an elderly water-caste diplomat, her robes billowing fluidly in the zero gravity, to grab hold of a railing at the far side of the room. Stranded floating in the middle of the chamber, Shasla of the fire caste didn't wait for rescue. Instead, they locked arms, stabilizing themselves as they reached out towards others. Once they had gathered enough Tau to them, they began to push off from one another to slowly drift towards the exit, or to nearby walls, where they kicked off to angle their trajectory to the open doors. One such fire warrior positioned himself against a bulkhead and braced, his armor-clad hooves pressing against the smooth surface of the wall before, with a powerful shove, he launched himself toward Tashia, his arms outstretched. She caught him, staggering slightly as she pulled him to solid footing in the consistent gravity of the corridor. Another followed. Then another. Tashia took a step back. Under the direction of the aircast, the other Tau quickly formed clusters, using one another as platforms to launch themselves toward the exit and the waiting arms of the fire warriors.
All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill.
A loud voice boomed through the ship-wide comms system. The voice was sharp, authoritative.
All non-essential personnel, return to your quarters immediately. This is a ship-wide emergency. Return to your quarters and lock yourself inside.
A moment of hesitation passed through the gathered crew in the corridor. It was an unusual order, to be sure, but the Tau were accustomed to following orders, particularly in tense situations such as this. The Tau that had gathered in the corridor began to disperse, except for the fire warriors that were helping the last of the stranded crew from the observation deck. Tashia moved with a group of others. They were all from different castes. Some moved in confident, disciplined strides, while others were more hesitant, giving one another apprehensive glances. Nobody spoke. One by one, they peeled away until Tashia found herself moving through the narrow corridors of the ship, alone. Her pulse quickened. Apparently, her billeting was far from the others. She took a deep breath to steady her nerves. Whatever was happening, those in charge would have it under control, she told herself. The Shore Strike Armada was made up of the best and brightest the Empire had to offer. She put her trust in that, and in the ethereals that led them. She closed her eyes. She imagined Arncola somewhere on the bridge, cool and calm. An inspiration to all under her command. As if to shake her from her daydream, the ship violently shook again. Placing a hand on the wall to steady herself, Tashia picked up her pace. Then the lights began to fail. It was subtle at first, a flicker here and there, a momentary dimming, like a faltering breath. But slowly, the disruptions grew more pronounced. They grew into stuttering flashes that either illuminated the corridor with blinding light or flooded it in suffocating darkness. As the lights strobed, they cast eerie, jagged shadows on the walls of indistinct figures that weren't there. Shadows of figures that, as she saw them out of the corners of her eyes, seemed to peel themselves off the walls and reach out to grab at her. Then the lights died completely, and Tashia was swallowed by the darkness. She stopped, her blood running cold. Slowly the red emergency lighting sputtered to life, and Tashia could see once again, as the way ahead was lit in shades of red and black. Suddenly a distant scream tore through the uneasy silence of the corridor. Not a startled cry, but one of raw terror and pain that was cut brutally short. It was followed by another shriek of agony, and finally by a howl of something wild and crazed. Tashia felt her gut twist at the sound, as a feeling of dread built within the pit of her belly. Her limbs became stiff and heavy as she forced herself to shuffle forward into the unknown. When she rounded a corner, she saw something up ahead, a large shape slumped against a wall at the next junction. In the weak crimson lighting, it was hard to get a good look at it. But after a couple more steps, it became clear enough to see. It was a body. A Tau lay sprawled in a widening pool of blood. Tashia ran to its side. It was a member of the water caste, his disheveled blue and grey robes darkened with spreading stains of crimson. His dead eyes were wide open, and the fingers on his hands still twitched and moved, as if they fought to live on somehow. But there was no such hope for life for this poor unfortunate. His body had been torn open, the delicate fabric of his clothes slick with fresh gore. Deep gashes ran across his torso, as if the large claws of some kind of wild animal had slashed him repeatedly to send long, jagged sprays of blood to spurt across and stain the walls. His throat was gone. All that remained was a ragged, gaping wound where flesh and cartilage had once been. Was there some kind of wild beast loose on the ship? Had they been boarded, perhaps? Tashia asked herself. She knelt down and timidly reached out with a trembling hand to close the cadaver's eyes. Abruptly, a voice cried out over the ship's comms, making her jump.
"Attention all Tau! Heed this warning!
the strained, desperate voice commanded.
"We have been betrayed! Betrayal from within! Beware they!"
Then the message cut out with a sickening gurgle. A sharp, gruesome, wet sound that was followed by static and silence. Tashia's mind raced. Wild animals and warnings of betrayal. What was happening? What should she do? Was she still under orders to return to her quarters, or had the message over comms changed the situation? Tashia was totally unaccustomed to being in a situation like this. She was filled with doubt and indecision. And then she thought of Holland. She imagined him all alone in the cargo bay, unaware of the murderous beasts that stalked the ship. The image cut through her hesitation. She couldn't leave him. She wouldn't. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she turned sharply and sprinted toward the cargo bay, hooves slamming against the metal deck and echoing off down the darkened corridors. When she reached the cargo bay doors, she skidded to a halt. The cargo bay loomed before her, its vast interior swallowed by a thick darkness. The weak crimson emergency lights inside, doing little to hold the encroaching shadows at bay. She swallowed hard and stepped forward.
Holland?
Her voice was thin, barely above a whisper.
Holland, are you there?
There was no answer. Only the dull echo of her own words, bouncing off the cavernous walls. Rather than the scene of order it had been less than a couple of hours before, the room was now a chaotic mess. The neatly stacked crates and boxes lay in disorganized heaps, many of them broken, their contents strewn across the floor. Then she saw him. Holland was sat on the floor, his back against a dented metal supply crate. His chest and arms were bare with the top half of his uniform neatly folded and placed on the floor to one side. His posture was casual, with his legs sprawled out in front of him. But something about his demeanor felt wrong, terribly wrong. Between his feet lay a broken drone, its delicate frame smashed and twisted. Its single ocular lens had been smashed into large, jagged chunks of glass. Holland had wrenched the largest piece free and held it tightly in his hand, its sharp edges dripping with blood. Slowly, methodically, he dragged the glass shard across his left forearm, splitting the skin open in a long, rectangular shape. Tashia paused, dumbstruck, her stomach lurching as she tried to process the senseless act of self-butchery before her. She watched as Holland put down the makeshift knife and picked at the skin until, with a sickening tear, he ripped the strip of skin from his body. It peeled back to reveal the flesh and muscle underneath, raw and wet. As he wiggled his fingers, the exposed muscle tissue visibly quivered. He exhaled a shuddering breath. Not of pain, but of a perverse pleasure that sent a shiver of ecstasy through his body. Holland picked up the broken shard and, with wet slicing sounds, began to carve into his body once more. He cut long lines and spiraling symbols that intersected across his bloodied chest. Tashia came to her senses.
Holland, stop! What are you doing? You're hurting yourself.
She pleaded. Holland stopped his cutting and looked up at her, noticing her presence for the first time. He looked her in the eyes and smiled. But they were not Holland's eyes. They were jet black and devoid of the compassion and humor of the man she knew.
You came for me,
he said. Then he lunged. Reflexively, Tashia pulled back, the broken glass sailing past her face and splattering her with a streak of Holland's warm blood. She hesitated. Then Holland brought the shard slashing back the other way and sliced across her torso. It was surprisingly sharp and cut through both fabric and skin. Tashia cried out in pain. Thankfully, the resulting wound wasn't deep, but it was nonetheless painful. Confused, she frantically fell backwards, stumbling over a fallen crate. with Holland's follow-up swing slashing through the air where her throat had been but a heartbeat before. Tashia's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she scrambled to her feet and ran away from the gentle man she had known all her life.
Holland, please stop! What's wrong with you?
She yelled as she raced out of the cargo bay with Holland giving chase right behind her. She glanced back at him. For a moment she thought she saw a glimpse of the man she knew. The one that used to make her laugh, that had thrown sticky tree sap in her hair as a child, and had practically begged to be assigned to this ship so they could stay together. But then it was gone. He dropped to all fours and bounded after her like a croot hound closing in on its prey, all vestiges of humanity abandoned. He pounced. Tashia threw herself to the side, her shoulder slamming against a bulkhead as he tumbled past her, leaving a bloodied smear from his open wounds across the floor. She turned and ran, her pulse thundering in her ears as she took a corridor that led towards the aft of the ship. She saw a huddled group of Guevesa skulking in the shadows.
Help me, please!
She pleaded. They turned to look at her, and it was then that she saw that they'd gouged out their own eyes. Raw, bleeding sockets looked towards her, and they began to wail and scream.
You don't need eyes to see the truth!
Shouted one as it reached out towards her. She swatted away its outstretched hand and ran on. Their screams turned into manic, deranged laughter as she rounded a corner. Several heartbeats later, she risked another quick glance behind her, and to her dismay, Holland was still chasing her. She passed several more Tau, dead, their bodies littering the ground, disfigured and mutilated. She leapt over a Tau in brown overalls, their face frozen in a rictus of terror. But she misjudged the distance in her haste, and her hoof barely cleared the corpse before it landed in a slick pool of blood. Her momentum betrayed her as she slid, tripped, and suddenly found herself airborne. She hit the floor with bone-jarring force as she rolled through gore and entrails. Behind her, Holland laughed.
Careful now, or you'll hurt yourself before I even get the chance.
Holland sadistically growled. Terror surged through Tashia. She crawled forward on her hands and knees towards the nearest door, her palms slipping in the blood that had pooled in the corridor, her breath coming in frantic gasps. At her approach, it automatically slid open and she threw herself inside. She slammed the palm of her hand on the door's control panel. With a hiss and a clunk, the door sealed shut and locked behind her, just as Holland's shadow loomed in the doorway. Tashia staggered back, her chest heaving. Holland rapped on the door a few times, but he couldn't get in. Tashia turned and took in her surroundings. She was in the airlock control room, a narrow, sterile room. To her left was the airlock's large reinforced door, a circular construct of metal and glass, revealing the small room beyond, with the exterior of the ship beyond that. To her right were racks of vacuum suits all hung in neat rows. Various tools, plasma cutters, safety tethers, and maintenance kits were carefully arranged in alcoves beneath each suit. Holland banged on the door again.
Tashia let me in. I just want to talk.
He lied. Tashia ignored him and went to the control panel next to the airlock and activated the comms system.
Can anyone hear me? Please, can anyone hear me?
She waited for a reply, but there was only static. Tashia spun around as a heavy thud shook the door. Then another. The metal groaned under the strain of Holland's fists as he hammered them against it over and over. The impacts, impossibly strong, caused the metal to dent and warp with each superhuman strike. Whatever that thing was, it couldn't be Holland, could it? Had he and the other Guevesa been hiding their true abilities all this time? Tashia questioned. The door began to twist out of its frame as Holland continued to force his way in. Tashia's eyes darted around, searching for something, anything to defend herself with. She saw a plasma cutter, half buried under a tangle of cables beneath one of the vacuum suits. She snatched it up, almost dropping it, as her trembling fingers wrapped around the grip. The power cell was still slotted in.
Please be charged,
she said aloud as she activated it. The tool flared to life, a blinding arc of searing white-blue light erupting between its prongs. With another deafening boom, the door had warped enough that Holland's fingers could reach through a small gap at the top. Getting a good grip, and with inhuman force, he yanked on it. Tashia's gaze snapped to the airlock controls beside her. She hesitated only for a second. There was no escape that way. Only the empty vacuum, and there was no time to put a suit on. But there was nowhere else to go. She activated the console. The outer door remained sealed, but the heavy inner door wheeled aside with a loud clunking sound. She backed into the airlock and brought the plasma cutter up. The control room door groaned, metal shrieking as Holland peeled it out of its frame and hurled it down the blood-slick corridor with a clatter. But the thing that lumbered into the room was Holland no longer. He had transformed into something monstrous. His frame was still roughly human, but twisted, bloated and wrong. The skin of half his body had changed into thick reddish scales, and his left arm was elongated and ended in fingers that looked more like jagged claws. The flesh all over his body had split in places where his body had outgrown itself, exposing overly massive raw muscle, engorged and threaded with veins that pulsed like writhing worms beneath his torn skin. But his face was the worst. The features were still his, the sharp jawline, the familiar cut of his unruly hair. But his skin was mottled with black lesions, his mouth curled into a crazed grin, and his eyes, once so friendly and warm, had become dark voids of bottomless malice. He took another single step forward towards the airlock where Tashia hid.
Stay back, please,
Tashia said, waving the plasma cutter in front of herself defensively, its intense blue glowing blade of energy sending cascading shadows across the wall. Holland ran at her. She swung wildly. Holland dodged, moving with an unnatural grace. He ducked in close and lashed out with his clawed hand, raking it across her face. She screamed. Pain exploded through Tashia's skull, a searing white-hot agony that drowned out everything else. The plasma cutter slipped from her grasp as her hands flew up to cover her ruined face. They gently cupped the deep gashes across her cheek and the pulpy mess of her eviscerated right eye that dribbled down her face. The plasma cutter hit the metal plates of the floor and then erupted in an intense flash of blinding white light. For the briefest of moments, the dazzling light of a miniature sun filled the airlock, so bright that it hurt Tashia's one remaining eye, even though it was covered by her hands. Holland howled and moved to cover his own eyes, but he was too late. Blinded, he staggered forward, flailing wildly. Fighting through the agony, Tashia forced open her remaining eye and pushed herself forward. She slipped past him, throwing herself back into the control room and activating the console to close the airlock door, with Holland still inside. The heavy hydraulics kicked in and the door wheeled back into place. Holland's vision returned as the locks engaged, and he realized he was trapped. Tashia's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor, her whole body racked with shudders of pain. One hand still clutched the ruined half of her face, blood pouring through her fingers to drip on the floor hot and sticky. She let out a long, drawn-out scream. The excruciating agony of her wounds were unbearable. Holland's twisted form pressed against the airlock door, his hands pounding against the reinforced metal and glass. But Tashia barely heard the clatter. She was too lost in the pain. Until she heard a crack. Her heart clenched. She looked up to see a thin fracture splintered across the reinforced glass. Apparently, Holland's otherworldly strength was even too much for the airlock to contain. She had no choice, she told herself, as she reached for the console again.
No, Tasha. Wait, it's me.
Holland called, his voice raw with desperation.
Tasha, please, I don't know what happened.
Her bloodied hand hesitated over the controls. Slowly, she turned. In the airlock, she saw Holland, as he had been. His grotesque mutations had gone. His skin had smoothed, his eyes returned to their familiar warm brown. He looked like himself again. Could it really be him? Could she take the chance if it wasn't? Was she killing Holland or saving herself?
Don't do this.
He begged.
It wasn't me. Please. Tasha,
She pressed the button. With a whoosh of expelled air, the airlock's outer door sprang open. Tasha watched as Holland was ripped from the airlock in an instant, his body flung into the void beyond. His body jerked, arms outstretched toward her, his mouth forming silent words that none could hear. A name, an apology, a confession. She would never know. When he had disappeared into the distance, she collapsed, gasping, shaking, alone. The vision of her one remaining eye blurred with tears as she sobbed in both pain and grief. But for the Tau of the Fourth Sphere expansion, the horrors had only just begun.